I think you saw, when you registered, or if you've come to some of the prior talks in this series, that we have a prompt, a couple sentences from the Indian writer and thinker Arundhati Roy. And I'm going to start just to ground myself and all of us in kind of the premise of this series. So she wrote about almost a year ago now, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So I've been thinking about those paragraphs for a while now, knowing this day was coming. And I ended up with 3 questions that I'm going to try to answer, share my view on over the next 40 minutes or so. The first question that comes to me is, okay, is the pandemic a portal? And if it is, in what sense? So I'll share my thoughts about that. If it is a portal, from what to what? That seems like a natural next question. And then, informed by both of those, the third question I'd offer up is, given that, how might we conduct ourselves in these times? And so for all of those things, I'll share my thoughts. And for you to decide what you think about them, I want you to know a little bit about me and my frames of reference. So I'll just start with a few of those. I'm a white woman. I've lived most of my life in New England. I'm middle-aged, I'm middle class. So there's some things I can see pretty clearly, some things I probably don't see so clearly, just given those group memberships. I'm trained as a biologist. I'm also trained in complex systems, and particularly with mathematical computer simulations of complex systems. Being humbled by the complexity of systems is probably the primary characteristic of my training in a way. I've brought that perspective on systems to the issue of climate change, and then lately also to issues like racial justice and health and equity. That work has led me to be involved in and fascinated by many networks. And so what I've learned in networks is another thing I'll bring tonight. I've had so many mentors who've taught me so many different things. They will be woven in tonight. And I'll just call out particularly Donella Meadows, who Carly mentioned in the introduction. Donella Meadows was one of the co-authors of The Limits to Growth in 1972. Her other most well-known book, I think, is called Thinking in Systems. And I'll also name Joanna Macy, who has done so much important work on how we meet this moment in time that Joanna calls the Great Unraveling. Other teachers I would name my garden. So yeah, Carly mentioned my husband Phil and I grow a lot of food. And any of you who are gardeners know a garden is a teacher in many, many ways. I'm a land rambler, walker, explorer, and I share land here in our small town of Vermont with my neighbors in a co-housing community. And of course, we're settlers on this land, the traditional lands of the Abenaki people. And the final teacher I would name is are both my children. My journey to be their mother has taught me an awful lot. So you'll probably hear many of those themes in my remarks tonight. So if I'm going to give you my thoughts about whether the pandemic is a portal from the point of view of systems theory, it would be good if we started with a shared definition of a system. And so I'm going to use the definition I learned from Donella Meadows, who said a system is a collection of elements connected in such a way that they produce a pattern of behavior. Okay, so a system is a collection of elements connected in such a way that they produce a pattern of behavior. And if you want, you can think of this pattern of behavior as their purpose. So what are some systems? Well, your body is a system, your family is a system, your pancreas, a cell in your pancreas is also a system. The IBM Corporation, my garden, and orchestra, all of us here for the next hour connected by Zoom. The global economy, of course, is a system, and it's situated in a much larger system, the living earth, of which it's a completely dependent part. Sometimes it also helps to say what's not a system. So not all collections of objects are systems. If I had a pile of sand on my desk, that would be a collection of objects, those grains of sand. But there's not any particular behavior connected or created by the connections between those grains of sand. So we probably would say that's not a very interesting system. The way that systems behavior is controlled or determined by their connections leads to a bunch of interesting characteristics. And so I want to share a few of those because they have bearing on, is the pandemic a portal? If it is, what sort of portal? One thing that systems are well known for are feedback loops. Sometimes this is called circular causation. And so a feedback loop is when one variable in a system, say A, when a change in A causes a change in B, but then the change in B feeds back to cause a change in A, that's a feedback loop. And feedback loops come in two basic flavors. One kind takes very small change and amplifies it to huge impact or huge disturbance. And the other kind does the opposite. It takes perturbations and responds to them by bringing the system back to some initial state or some steady state. Feedback loops and their interconnections mean that systems have what we call nonlinear behavior. And that just means that you may be going along with a little change in A means a little change in B, a little change in A, little change in B. Suddenly a little change in A, really big change in B. That's nonlinearity, and that fools our human intuition. And that's one of the reasons systems surprise us. So all this feedback, nonlinearity, it gives rise to things like cascades and convergences and ripples. And it makes systems basically unpredictable and uncontrollable in the way that we humans are so tempted to try to control things in sort of a top-down command and control fashion. So those are some characteristics of systems. And as I think about it, none of them really preclude the possibility of portals. Although it does start to tell us maybe something about the nature of portals. If they exist, if the pandemic is some kind of portal, it's probably not something that we design or control. At best, it might be something that we nudge or steer or interact or dance with. But there are two other characteristics of systems that do constrain maybe the potential of portals. So I want to talk about those for a minute. The first one is, sometimes we say that systems are path dependent. And what we mean is that the condition of a system at any moment in time depends not only on its condition in the past, but also on the path that took it from the past to the present. And so I want to give you one example. So much about systems makes more sense with an example. So many of you probably know about the urban heat island effect. This is the way that the built environment of cities absorbs more heat than the surrounding areas because of all the concrete and steel and asphalt. One thing that mediates the urban heat island effect is if there's more green space. So parks and green roofs and tree cover, tree-lined streets, those all lessen the urban heat island effect. And this is really important because obviously with climate change, we know, and in fact, we're already experiencing more heat waves, stronger heat waves, more frequent heat waves. So it matters to what extent a neighborhood in a city has green space or not. And here's an interesting thing. If you look at maps of cities and maps of the green space, what you find is that the greener the area, the more likely that the people who live in it are affluent and white. So that's really significant because it says that this effect to be protected from climate change isn't uniformly distributed in cities. But here's where path dependence comes in. You can look at older maps of cities and you can look at the areas that were redlined. So all of those practices from real estate to credit to municipal ordinances that were designed to keep African-American people from living in certain neighborhoods, those redline maps line up pretty well in many cities with the areas that have less green space. So you start to see the path dependence, right? Long ago, we had redlining. It actually shows up where trees are in cities today. But path dependence goes back further than that because redlining didn't just pop into the world one day, right? It was based on a worldview created to support an economic system based on slavery. So white supremacy as a justification for slavery somehow connects through path dependence to redlining to here we are today with the urban heat island effect. And so I can't imagine any kind of portal that we're going to move through where suddenly trees are going to be uniformly distributed across our cities, where that legacy of white supremacy through redlining doesn't show up in what's green and cool and what's not green and hotter. So path dependence. The second principle is related, but a little bit different. And that's momentum. It's the idea that systems keep going in the same direction unless you change something about them. So here's an example of that. In 2019, around the world, more than 120 new coal-fired power plants were built. And the average lifetime of a coal-fired power plant, I believe, is something like 30 years. So those coal-fired power plants, unless we turn them off before the end of their lifetime, are going to be producing greenhouse gases for decades into the future. And I can't imagine a portal where those coal-fired power plants are going to disappear. So the portal isn't going to be, I don't think, like a magical door, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where we walk through something into a changed world. The inequity, the pollution, the harm is going to be with us on the other side. What could be different, I think, could be our commitment to address all of that harm and our skills in addressing it, or our effectiveness. Maybe we've rearranged ourselves in some ways to be better able to address the past harm. So now the portal is starting to sound more like a transformation, isn't it? It's not a door, and it's also not a conveyor belt. It's not something we would just sit passively on and be carried into a new future. If the pandemic and all these other simultaneous crises are going to be a portal, it's going to be a portal of hard work and difficult choices, I think. So the good news is that systems can change. They do all the time. They transform, which I would define transformation as the ability of a system to respond to the same situation with a new pattern of behavior. So if we want to know if the pandemic and all the other crises we're experiencing is a portal, then we need to know if there's something about what we're experiencing that can accelerate the conditions for transformation. And so we need to know what are the conditions, how do systems transform? And there's many ways. There's a very famous paper by Donella Meadows called Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in Systems, that lists, I think, 10 different types of transformation. But I'm going to talk about the two most powerful, because if the pandemic is a portal, we're talking big, right? Portal isn't an insignificant change. It's a big change. So here's the first way systems can transform. They can transform when they have new connections, when the parts are connected in new ways. Remember how we said the connections between the parts determine a system's behavior? Same parts connected differently equals different behavior. So here's another story about that. A few years ago, I was working on a project where we were focused on green infrastructure. So ways to manage stormwater in cities. Another impact of climate change, you probably know, is more intense precipitation, which leads to more flooding. And just like for the urban heat island effect, green space helps a lot with this. It can allow the water to soak in like a sponge instead of running off of pavement and asphalt. So we were building a computer model in a US city about what their options were in this area. And we needed to bring in experts who knew all about the different aspects of what greening a city might do. So we were from out of town. We brought in the experts who really knew their city, and people started talking to each other. And at one table was the leader of the Children's Asthma Coalition. And she was there because with more green space, more particles are taken out of the air quality would improve, which would help improve asthma. At the same table was someone who led an organization called Riverkeeper, and they were concerned about the water quality of the river that ran through the city. And what blew me away is that in this relatively small city, those two folks had never met and they had never worked together. But what they started to see was that these same investments and same policies would move both of their agendas forward. And so suddenly there were two membership-based organizations, two emailing lists, two groups of people who might come to meetings and push for policy. So can you see how by virtue of a new connection in the system, something was possible that hadn't been possible before? So if the pandemic is going to be a portal, I think that's one of the ways that it could be. The second way that systems transform is when the people within them, especially the people in the dominant institutions and the dominant cultures, change what we call a worldview, a collection of values and assumptions and beliefs about how the world works. And so here's a thought experiment about how that might go down. Imagine if the dominant society here on Earth shifted its view of the purpose of a human life. What if instead of producing and consuming being what we were all here to do, maybe the purpose is to make art, maybe it's to heal past wounds, maybe it's to take care of each other and the earth. Think about if that switched. One day everyone woke up with a different definition of purpose. What would change when it comes to economics, to biodiversity, to how banks work, to how schools work, right? Everything would shift. So that's the other way the pandemic could be a portal, at least informed by systems theory, would be if something about it changed these deep underlying worldviews. So to my first question, is the pandemic a portal? If it is, what kind? So we've ruled out some things. It's not a door. It's not a conveyor belt. We have to take a lot of our past with us. It's captured in bricks and mortar and rules and habits. But if we can reorganize, if we can make new connections, if we can rewire systems, and if we can organize ourselves around different worldviews, then it could be something about this pandemic allows for transformation. And to me, that's what a portal would be. So that's my thoughts on the first question, which leads us to the second question on my mind, which is, if it is this type of portal, what's it a portal from and what's it a portal to? So let's start with the from what part of that question. Pretty clearly, this whole time we've been talking about converging crises. We've got a pandemic, we've got inequity of all sorts, we've got racial inequity, gender inequity, economic inequity, inequity between nations. We've got climate change, we've got biodiversity. So all these crises converging and cascading and interacting. And again, let's just bring that to life a little bit with a few examples. And unfortunately, there's endless examples. One today I read actually in Houston, thousands of vials of vaccine are at risk of being spoiled because of their power outage related to this unusual winter weather, which some people think is connected to climate change. So there you have the pandemic colliding with climate change. In 2018, a study just came out, but it looked at data from 2018. 8.7 million deaths worldwide were caused by the same thing. That's 1 in 5 deaths on planet Earth. Do you know what that was? It was air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, of course, are at the root of climate change. Now they're at the root of 1 in 5 deaths in the present moment. So now we have pandemic converging with climate change, converging with fossil fuels and air pollution. And of course, many of you probably saw the study scientists at Harvard did last year. They found that if you lived in a neighborhood that had historic level of high air pollution and you got ill with COVID-19, you were more likely to die from it because of your exposure to air pollution. So now we have air pollution connecting with the pandemic, connecting with climate change. Another recent study looked at what happens in places with natural disasters, including the kind that are made worse by climate change, like floods and hurricanes. They found that whenever the Federal Emergency Management Agency came in, and the more money they spent, actually, the stronger this effect was. The racial inequality in those communities got worse. So the way we're responding to climate disasters is actually making another crisis, inequality, worse. And so I hope you can see, all the ways in which it's not just one crisis, it's ramifying, rippling, tangling crises. So is that what this is a portal from crisis to something else? Well, I think that is a little superficial because most of us are recognizing more and more these crises aren't the root cause, right? They're symptoms. So if we take climate change, well, what causes that? Well, greenhouse gas emissions. What causes that? We've allowed a certain kind of economic activity to grow above a limit. But what allowed that to happen? Well, some sort of belief that there are no limits, or at least not ecological limits that apply to us. So it's sort of a type of superiority maybe. Or take racial inequalities. Well, we know underneath that is structural racism, different rules and laws and incentives that end up biasing access to opportunity and access to harm or exposure to harm. So that's interesting, right? We said there's this ecological kind of superiority, and now we're saying within that, within frameworks like white supremacy, a kind of superiority or hierarchy among people. And so put that all together, and what the image I start to see is one of a pyramid, right? And at the top of the pyramid, we put white men, and then perhaps white women, and then people of color, Earth's ecological systems somewhere down below that. But of course, the actual world, the reality, isn't organized like that. The ecologies of planet Earth aren't pyramids, they're webs. And so if I had to define the side of the portal that we're on, I would suggest that we think of it as a situation with a world, or with a human world, and at least a dominant culture. Not all cultures, of course, subscribe to this pyramid idea, but with a dominant culture organizing itself as though the world is a pyramid when the world is actually a web. The other side of the portal, I would say, is where we've resolved that contradiction, where we figured out how to organize ourselves as a web for a world that's actually a web. And many people have said this. I want to share a quote from Donella Meadows, who's come up a lot this evening. And this amazes me that this is from 1982. So this is not a new perspective by any means. In 1982, Donella Meadows said, "The world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system." Okay, in other words, it's a web. We treat it, she said, as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. Our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. So she's talking about that same thing, I would say, that this side of the portal is characterized by mismatch between how we're operating and how the earth operates. And the other side of the portal somehow would resolve that mismatch. Donella Meadows is not the only one who said that by any means. The eco-theologian Thomas Berry talked about moving from a worldview that was a collection of objects to one that was a communion of subjects. Joanna Macy talks about our industrial growth society, organized as though we're billiard balls bouncing off of each other. And she says the alternative, the life-affirming society is this idea of interbeing, right, of all these webs of relationship. And of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave us the phrase, the inescapable network of mutuality. So I think there's something here when you have people from so many different perspectives naming this web as a fundamental underlying part of reality. And our job, and the thing that this portal is taking us to, is to figure out how to resolve that mismatch and get in better alignment with how the world works. So to recap about question number 2, I would say, if we're talking about the pandemic and related crises as a portal, then it's from a mismatch, acting like the world is a pyramid when it's a web, to resolving that mismatch, acting like the world is a web when it's a web. So maybe that's our work. If the portal's not passive and we have to do something, we need some kind of transformation. Maybe that's what the work is. But there's an added twist, isn't there? Because it's not the only thing we need to do to address this mismatch. We've been talking about, we're in the middle of lockdown, pandemic, new variants arising, climate change, floods, fires, a growing wealth gap. Sometimes I joke with people that what we have to do is change the wheels on the bus while we're driving the bus. And the bus is full of the most precious things to us. The bus is full maybe of our children. And we have to drive it and change the wheels, the worldview at the same time. But we're not just driving down a straight, easy road anymore, are we? We're driving this bus through an obstacle course. There's flames and fire and potholes and crises. So that brings us to, how do we conduct ourselves? How do we survive through these current threats and move out of that somehow reorganized out of this mismatch, out of the pyramid view in a world that's actually a web? What I'd like to offer as food for thought to this question of how do we conduct ourselves is the idea of multi-solving. So this is an idea that my colleagues and I at Climate Interactive have been engaging with for some years now. We define multi-solving as actions, investments, and policies that solve more than one problem at the same time. I'll just say that again. Actions, investments, and policies that solve more than one problem at the same time. So maybe that's making you think a little bit about driving the bus while changing the wheels on the bus while avoiding the obstacles. And the good news is that multi-solving exists all around us. And like so much in systems, a few examples, I think, help bring it home. So I'll share two of my, two that I find particularly interesting. One comes close to home for me from Vermont. The city of Burlington has a municipal electric utility, and they have a COVID-19 pandemic stimulus or economic recovery package. And in that recovery package from the electric utility is a program for home weatherization. And it's aimed at people who are living on a low income. So let's just, for multi-solving, ask how many problems are solved at the same time there or are addressed. First, there's economic stimulus, right? So particularly in the construction trades, there's good jobs in making homes more energy efficient. There's climate change. An energy efficient home is going to contribute less to climate change. There's a lowering of that pyramid, right? By focusing, by targeting on the incentives to marginalized communities, you're helping people who have a high energy burden. So that's the percentage of their income that they spend on their utility bill is somewhat ameliorated so that they have more of their income to spend on food or medicine or education. So there's one example. The second one is something that I think is really important to watch in this time of the pandemic, which is mutual aid organizing. And I bet many of you listening are involved in this in different ways. I was on a panel not too long into the pandemic with someone who was in a county in California. And early on in the pandemic, they just saw this sort of chaos and problems, and you had agencies with resources and people who needed help. And they ended up forming kind of organically a weekly conference call. It included county agencies, city agencies, churches, grassroots community groups. And it was just every week, it was about who needed help and who had resources and how to fit those things together. So remember what I said about rewiring systems as a way to transform them? This sounds like rewiring, doesn't it? Like people who weren't connected are now connected. But it sounds like rewiring in a time of emergency. They're not just there to rewire, right, as some abstract exercise. They're there in order to make sure that the people who need diapers have got diapers, and the people who need eviction help, anti-eviction help, are getting the support that they need. So they're doing a transformative action, but it's in service also of surviving a period of emergency. Now, those are two relatively localized examples, right? A city and a county. I want to go to the global scale for a minute, just to give you a sense of the huge potential of multi-solving. In 2018, the World Health Organization did a study, and they found that if the world were on a path to meet the Paris climate goals, the costs of being in that path would be offset by the savings on the health side. Remember, air pollution, 1 in 5 deaths worldwide. Getting off of fossil fuels because of climate change has this huge health dividend. And think about that a little bit. I was remembering my college chemistry classes. Any of you who've taken chemistry know that sometimes if you can get the atoms in a chemical reaction to line up in a different way, there's a huge release of energy when that happens, right? If the atoms don't shift around, no reaction happens. So think about this, about connecting health and climate, and suddenly climate change isn't just an expense, but it actually has a benefit, a savings. If there's going to be a motive force to push us through whatever this portal is, I think it's going to come from multi-solving, from changing how we're organized to release this new energy of synergy and of potential. The last example of multi-solving, I think, is just very topical for us in the US right now. We're in the early first 100 days of the Biden administration, and we keep hearing this phrase, whole of government approach to climate change. That's so heartening to me as someone who is focused on breaking down silos when it comes to addressing climate change. So we have environmental justice leaders in the EPA. We have someone who was the resilience officer for the city of DC, who's now in the Housing and Urban Development Agency. We have the Secretary of Transportation saying things like ensuring equity is central to everything we do. I mean, believe me, that's not how secretaries of transportation typically talk in this country. So we're back to path dependence a little bit now. Path dependence isn't always, you know, these horrible things like redlining. Why is it that the Biden administration is breaking down silos? I think it's because of decades of leadership in the environmental justice community making this case. And then more recently, youth organizing. Think about the Sunrise Movement, moving the Green New Deal forward. There's a lot of the ideas of the Green New Deal within the Biden administration, even if they're not always using that language. And so we have seeds planted a long time ago moving forward. And that's part of whatever is going into this pandemic as well. So to this third question of how shall we conduct ourselves, I'd say here's our opportunity. It lies in the way we're navigating all of these crises. Can we navigate them from a worldview of interconnection? Can we navigate them by actually creating new connections and healing old divisions? If we can do that, we're transforming systems while also responding to crises. I've had the great pleasure, because of the research we're doing on multi-solving, to interview people, to watch projects that come from this multi-solving point of view. And one thing that's taught me is that there's some different, and I think very special, attitudes and approaches that come along with multi-solving. And the good news is that they're accessible to all of us. And so I'm going to name 7, and that sounds like a lot, but they're easy to remember. 7 practices of multi-solvers. First of all, they center learning. They're continuously learning, they're iterating. Often they're starting very small. Doesn't have to be a big deal. Multi-solvers are always asking, how can the solution to my problem solve your problem? They're always assuming my well-being is linked to your well-being. And so that's where the heart and the ethics of multi-solving come in. We know a lot of coalitions that are transactional. It's like, to get the votes, we'll show up for your issue. This is more than that. It's like your health and my health. Nobody's healthy till everybody's healthy. Following directly from that, multi-solvers invest in relationships. They optimize for multiple goals rather than maximizing for one. And wherever they can, they divest of patterns of domination and they invest in patterns of cooperation. Now, I bet you all know people who operate like that. In fact, many of you may be people who operate like that. And so here's the thing, when you choose to conduct yourself in this way, I would say you're already on the other side of that portal. This portal has some interesting properties. Sometimes it's invisible. Here's a story about that. Years ago, colleagues and I were setting up a training program. We had this goal of building really strong relationships among the participants. We planned for months about how we were going to create the conditions, what questions we'd ask, how we would design the place. Even the menu came into it. And it really worked. In the first bringing together of this group, people just felt so comfortable and so connected. So then we were doing our review afterwards with one of my colleagues, and he said, I've never seen a group bond like that. That was incredible. It was like magic. So that's property number 1 of this portal. For some of us, and me too, some of the time, it's so unfamiliar that it seems like magic. But it's just somebody who's on the other side of a portal. Here's another interesting property. I think you can move back and forth through this portal. You can be in it and you can fall right back out into the land of the pyramid. You know, I've been in change projects that were 100% about this theory of mutuality and reciprocity. And then I get triggered, somebody says something, I get mad. I'm as someone who has spent 50 years in the institutions created by the pyramid, I'm right ready to go there to that domination power over mode. I was on one side of the portal and then in a split second can be back on the other side. And here's the last interesting property of this portal. I think people and organizations can be across the portal in some domains and not in other domains. One example of that from my world, a really well-known climate organization a couple years ago, International Climate Organization. So in the mutualistic interactive web when it comes to how the climate works, but the executive director turned out was sexually harassing members of his staff. So when it comes to the domain of gender, we're right back in the pyramid, even while the policy we're working on is in the domain of the web. And that's a kind of interesting thing about this portal, isn't it? It's all happening at once. And we have a systems word for this kind of property. We call it coherence, when there's self-similar patterns across different scales and domains. And so I think we can be coherent with either pattern. We can be coherent with the pyramid, we can be coherent with the web. And to some extent, it's a matter of choice and attitude and approach. So my final thought on all of this, and then I'd love to get to some questions. What really is this portal? It's not a door, it's not a conveyor belt, it's not passive. It's always accessible, and there's already people, in fact, there's already whole cultures on the other side sharing space with us. We're walking, interdigitated. And it's not a one-way trip. We may cycle back and forth across this portal multiple times in a day. So the portal is a pattern. It's a pattern we can feel. It's a pattern we can get in sync with. And it's a pattern that to some extent, I think we get to choose and learn about. So here we are at the end of my time to speak, and we're about to leave this little bubble of our conversation. And we're gonna go back out into the polar vortex. We're gonna go into the vaccine inequity, new variants, democracy in crisis, climate change. And I wish I could, give you all safety and security and say it was all gonna be okay. I can't do that, but what I can tell you is there really is a portal. I've been through it with amazing people, though I seem to keep dropping out of it because I have more unlearning to do. I think you can find this portal, maybe you already have, and I believe that everything that matters to me, and now I'm thinking of those kids on the bus while we're changing the wheels on the bus, is riding on more and more of us finding our way to that portal and spending more and more time on the other side. So I say, go find it, go find that portal, what it is for you, and send back breadcrumbs so that others can find it. So thank you and good luck.
Thank you so much, Beth, for working with these prompts so thoughtfully and profoundly. And I have so many questions, and I am sure that folks in the audience do too. And so everyone, I'd just like to invite you to put your questions in Q&A so that we can start working with those. Beth, one of the things that, it's so, there's so many big shifts that you're talking about, and you are an incredible systems thinker on this global scale, but you are also incredible at helping people think about what this means in their day-to-day lives. And one of the things that you've talked about tonight and that you talk about with multi-solving is this interconnectedness and making sure that the right people and people from all groups that need to be there are at the table or in conversation or in Zoom or whatever it is now that we're doing. You talked about that in your first example, I think, with someone from an asthma group and river keepers. So for people who want to be working in this world of multi-solving, how do you do that? How do you get those invitations out? How do you know who to invite in to these conversations that may have been siloed for quite some time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a few criteria. One that we use is to think about whatever project, idea, seed that you have, to have at least one person, one champion for all of the things that could get better if that project were to happen. So let's say it's a cycling lane. So what could get better? Well, less emissions from transportation. So you want the transportation planners there. More people with safe access to physical activity. So you want the public health experts there, right? Studies have shown that if there's more cycling on the streets of a city, there's actually more economic activity at small businesses. So you want to have like the Chamber of Commerce or something like that. So think that through. What are at least the ones you can see? You might miss some and you'll find them later. So have at least one champion of each of those. But then if you can, you want to think about the characteristics of the people, because you want people who are curious. You want people who are learners, because that public health expert is going to have to be kind of humble about transportation engineering. She may not know anything about that. And so I think we all know there's some people who cling so much to their expertise. That's going to be a drag on your multi-solving process. And then the other way to think about it, and I would say it's just another layer, is also to think about formal and informal power and leaders. If this bike lane is going through a community, you want to make sure that you have people who live in that community who may think of dangers and problems that might not occur to you as an outsider, like is it going to be noisy or dangerous during the construction period? Is it going to lead to green gentrification, right? This problem we see around the country when you put in sustainable infrastructure, it actually raises property values and people can't afford to live in the neighborhood anymore. So if you missed having someone from the neighborhood in your process, you could have that unanticipated side effect that would be the opposite of what you were trying to do. So those would be some of the questions I would ask myself.
Thanks so much. That's a really powerful list of questions, and I'm seeing in the Q&A that people are really interested in these lists that you're working with, including this list of the 7 things, properties that you talked about, and we've got a number of people wondering where they can find that information. I know you wrote this talk for this invitation, and so is some of this accessible somewhere else?
Yeah, besides in my head.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a good place to start is, our organization, Climate Interactive, the website's easy. It's just climateinteractive.org, and someone could probably stick it in the chat.
Shelley's putting that in chat.
Okay, thanks, Shelley. So our writing, for instance, I talked about a lot of case studies. Really what I know about multi-solving, I've just learned by watching these bright spots. So you'll find those case studies. You'll find an article, it's a couple years old now, from the Sandford Social Innovation Review, where we tried to look across case studies and ask what they had in common. One of the things about multi-solving that's tricky sometimes is the specific stories are really inspiring, but they're also very place specific. What fits in one place won't be what you need in another place. And so you can learn and be inspired by these case studies, but look beneath them is what I would say. Like, look beneath the surface. And it's not so much, oh, that was a bike lane and it was 7 miles and it had these attributes, but how did they bring the community together? Oh, there was this attitude of listening. There was this attitude of going slowly. There was this attitude of optimizing for multiple goals. And so don't get distracted, I guess I would say, or feel that the specifics are the gold. The specifics are amazing, but the gold is the attitudes and approaches underneath them.
Thank you so much. There's a kind of a follow-up question to that's coming through in a number of different questions here. And one of them is more along those lines of what are tactical ways to change the dominant institutions that have been developed into our society for so many years, to change from the pyramid to the web. One person writes, not to be cynical, but it seems like a very long time before we can see tactical changes?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to answer that. I think I would just say a little bit more about coherence. And this has been a great comfort for me, actually. In systems theory, a lot is made about leverage points, right? These are the places where a small application of effort can create a huge change. And I thought for a lot of my career that that was, you know, the leverage point was the secret that you had to find if you wanted to create the transformations that seemed to be needed. And leverage points are important and worth thinking about. But I look back across many projects where we identified leverage points but didn't actually have the power to act at them. You know, we did a project on commodity agriculture almost 20 years ago, and we came back to the farmer advisory group and we said, it's these dynamics of oversupply that are pushing the price down, that's leading to these other problems in your community. Like we had found a shiny new answer, and we'd seen the leverage point, and the farmers kind of looked at us and they were like, yeah, we know that, having been farmers for decades, and there are these, you know, corporate entities, major international or global corporations that are far more powerful than us, and we're locked into the system that we can't change. So a leverage point you don't have the power to do anything about is actually less of a way to change a system than a very small place where you do have power to do something. And so the thing about coherence is 20 times a day, like in your marriage, in your parenting, with your staff, you can decide, are you going to come out of a domination paradigm, or are you going to come out of a partnership paradigm? And the thing about coherence is, the other attractive thing about coherence is that it does bring things to scale. We're just not used to thinking about it that way. Here's an example of that. Let's say in my staff meeting, I cultivate this partnership attitude. And we all really practice listening. We practice, you know, respect and consent. And then let's say my newest employee is the only one in the office when the phone rings and the community group is ready. There's this big moment, but we need someone to go. And the only person who can go is the newest person on the staff. But she's had a year of staff meetings. She's never led a community group, but she has seen actually what does it mean to be coherent with a partnership pattern. So coherence allows you to improvise, right? It allows you to practice in low stakes situation, and you don't know, you know, when the real opportunity is going to come. Also, if we're driving the school bus through obstacle courses, there's not going to always be the command and control leader to tell everybody what to do. So if everyone is familiar with and doing their best to operate out of a partnership coherent pattern, the potential to improvise, even if the phone system went down or Zoom's not working or there's an ice storm or there's a fire, is much more distributed in systems. So coherence can actually bring things to scale, and it is a way to still be able to push in the direction you need to go, even if things are very tumultuous. And I think those are two characteristics we need in these times. And the thing about coherence, it's even less predictable than leverage points. So we're unlikely to have that satisfaction that we get from this top-down plan of, in year one, we'll do this, and in year two, we'll do that. I mean, how many of us I've written so many of those plans in my life. They don't seem to be the way to go in tumultuous times. The trade-off, if you invest in coherence, is a lot more uncertainty. You don't know where that coherence is going to lead. But I've seen enough patterns change through that form that my personal choice is that's where I'm putting my energy these days.
Thanks for that. It feels like there are infinite opportunities for that right now. So I can absolutely see why that's something that we need to carry us through this portal. A question, there's a couple questions around this, so I'm going to kind of merge them together. At Climate Interactive, you've got this really powerful online tool that's that we haven't talked about tonight, but we can link to it so that people can check it out in Rhodes. And a lot of your background and thinking is based on science and these big equations that are running the system and also informing the way that you think about these large systems. What do you think the role is for artists and storytellers as we pass through this portal? And I really appreciate what you said about how it's not just a single passing through. We can be moving back and forth and in various different ways. So I'm hoping to those of you who are posing questions along those lines that I'm getting to the heart of it, but that role for artists and writers in this.
Yeah. One thing, wow, there's so many ways that I would answer that. One thing that you see again and again is that often the answer that is morally right or ethically right is also the answer that's good systems thinking. So here's an example of this right now. We're seeing the rich countries of the world being unwilling to invest in making sure there's vaccine available for the poorest countries in the world. So we would say that's unethical, right? And an artist or a writer might really be able to help us see just the moral bankruptcy of that by telling us the story of children or families who are going to miss out on this vaccine. Systems thinking, in this case, the epidemiological version of it is going to say, wow, if there's uncontrolled virus in some parts of the world, it's going to mutate. It's going to undermine the fact that you all have a vaccine for variant 1 because we're going to give you variant 79. And all your millions of dollars, billions of dollars, getting your whole population vaccinated is going to be worthless. You're going to be back where you started. So that's what I mean as an example of morality and systems thinking lining up. And some people are moved by the science and by the equations. Other people are moved by the story or by their hearts. So I think we need people using both modalities. And I think we need more discourse between the two as we're trying to navigate. I know for me that if I see that the morality and ethics and the analysis are lining up and pointing in the same direction, that's what gives me confidence, like that's a direction to go.
Thank you.
Sure.
There are so many questions in the Q&A, and I invite those of you who we can't get to tonight to reach out via the website and to engage more with what's happening at Climate Interactive and with this thinking. And Beth, I'd like to just give you a moment in case there are some closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with before we wrap up this evening. And also to remind everybody as you're thinking about that, that we in the next few days will post this lecture online after we do a little bit of work to clean it up, and you are all welcome to share it widely with your list and groups and friends, and to check out the other lectures on the Spring Creek Project's YouTube channel.
Yeah, thanks for the chance for a last word. The thing that comes to mind, I don't always succeed at this piece of advice I'm going to give everyone else, but I try to hold everything lightly right now. The rate of acceleration of change is mind-boggling to me. Much of it is distressing, terrifying, tragic, but equally, astoundingly possible. We in the last year, updated some of the data in our models of climate and energy, and the prognosis got better because technology improved at a rate faster than, you know, what modeling had thought it could. So things are getting better faster than we thought, and they're also getting, you know, worse. And I hope this theme of systems being unpredictable, uncontrollable, we are, for better or worse, in this uncertainty. But some combination of getting worse really quickly and getting more possible really quickly means that ideas that just couldn't move, you know, a year ago, 6 months ago, are suddenly possible. So don't limit your plans based on what you used to think was possible, because we
Thank
just don't know.
you.
Thank
That's a
you.
perfect note to end on. We're so grateful that you can join us this evening and for the lecture series, and we look forward to following along with you and learning with you in the months and years ahead.
Yeah. Thank you
Thanks
so much
yeah.
for this chance.